Welcome to the show. My guest today is Joyce Carell, the Assistant Director for Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate at the National Counterintelligence and Security Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Joyce, always a pleasure. Good to talk to you again. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here.
Let me just set a little context for our discussion. The old adage, trust but verify, is taking on new meaning with the ever-increasing focus on supply chain risk management. From the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC program, to Section 889 and the banning of certain Chinese-made telecommunication products, agencies and vendors alike must do more than just say they're doing enough to protect their supply chains. This means organizations must rely on data to prove their trustworthiness of the supply chain, and the data also must provide insights into everything from foreign ownership to insider threats to chain of custody. The challenge of depending on data is how to deal with the volume of information and deciding what is most valuable. This is why agencies and companies are applying analytical tools and machine learning algorithms to identify potential risks. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence is helping agencies overcome these challenges of supply chain risk management. And my guest, Joyce Carell, the Assistant Director for Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate at the National Counterintelligence Security Center at ODNI, will tell us how. Now, Joyce, I set us up. I talked all the hot topics. I hit every buzzword that there is, CMMC, 889. I could keep going. But let's just discuss the state of supply chain security from ODNI's perspective. Progress made so far, challenges still ahead. Let's get into our GAO report like status.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. One thing I want to point out is from a progress perspective, the last 3 years have really been a change from a government perspective. You touched on just a couple of things that are related to federal government procurement. But when I think about supply chain issues, I think much more broadly about how we source both goods and services like telecoms, energy, financial services. And I would say, like, going back to 2017, those were the first, big muscle movements from a government perspective. And one point I want to make as well is that all branches of government are actually involved in shaping our policies and the tools that we have to manage risk. The executive branch is issuing executive orders, Congress is drafting legislation, and we've got the courts that are hearing cases and rendering opinions that shape how the government can move forward or how the nation can move forward from a risk management perspective. So just to go back to 2017, the White House issued the Executive Order 13806, which is assessing and strengthening the manufacturing and defense industrial base and supply chain resilience. So that was the first baseline of our industrial base from a very broad supply chain resilience perspective, which was an important move. That was also the same year, a few months later, when DHS issued their binding operational directive on Kaspersky Labs. So 2017 was kind of the point of departure. And we've seen a number of things come out, since then, variety of actions in 2018. You already mentioned NDAA 889, the broad prohibition on federal spending for 5 Chinese companies. That same piece of legislation also gave us the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, as well as the Export Control Reform Act. So a lot of thought, bipartisan support for those types of actions in 2018. 2019, the executive branch takes a long, hard look at telecommunications security. The White House issues the executive order for securing the information communications technology and services supply chain, more in a more abbreviated fashion, known as the telecoms supply chain executive order. And so that was, the beginning of looking at our infrastructure and how we can manage risk with our infrastructure. Same year, the president signed the Secure Technology Act, which gave us the Federal Acquisition and Supply Chain Security Act, which established the Federal Acquisition Security Council. And now 2020, we have COVID, opening people's eyes to a whole slew of other supply chain related issues. So I could go on for a long time on these issues, but I'd like to give you a chance to ask a few more questions.
I got plenty to ask you because this is a topic. I'm funny that you go back to 2017. I want to feel like I've been writing stories about this since 2015, kind of warning agencies, hey, this is coming. This is going to be a big deal. And I think they're just kind of coming around to that this is a big deal. So that goes around why do you think it's kind of come up? Is it these actions like the EOs and the legislation and the court decisions, or did something else happen that was more of a wake-up call in the last 2, 3, 4 years?
So your first question, you actually asked, what are challenges? So what comes to mind with the question you just now asked is education. I really think one of the challenges, one of the impediments to raising awareness is educating people from all walks of life. In the risk management arena, for government, we have to, I work in a counterintelligence and security organization, but we have to bring together people from acquisition, people from our general counsel, disciplines that look not just at, federal acquisition regulations. They need to understand, Trade Secrets Act. So we rely on our attorneys to bring together a team of expertise. So I see the same thing in the private sector, having to bring together people from different disciplines who oftentimes speak with very different vocabularies in a shorthand unique to their discipline is one of the things that makes this a challenge to address people's learning curves. So I think that's one of the things. But back to 2015, certainly I was there with you in spirit as you were writing about this. But back, when a few administrations ago, when the Comprehensive Cyber National Security Initiative was launched, supply chain was a key pillar there. But back then, it was pretty much of an esoteric topic. There were other things, hardening your perimeter was a higher priority for many people. So, and that was a decade ago. But I think now it's a topic that has transitioned from esoteric to exoteric. It's more accessible to the public. COVID has made supply chain a dinner table conversation topic. So it's a combination of organizations learning more about third-party risk and operational risk and realizing the consequences of not attending to that risk. They could be devastating. So I think that's been sort of a change.
I love the fact it's a dinner table conversation now. I know my family would shun me if I brought it up too often. But you bring up COVID a couple of times, and let's talk a little bit about that. How has the pandemic impacted the supply chain and the approaches to securing the supply chain?
Well, so there are two things that come to mind. This has been covered quite exhaustively in the media. The fact that with government shutting down the flow of people and goods and just shutting down businesses, there were shortages of supplies, and the average person began wondering, well, here's this disease. Can I get tested? Where can I get supplies for testing? When is the vaccine going to be available? Where can I buy paper towels? So just things that people took for granted. And in the U.S., we live in a very luxurious environment, from availability to go to grocery stores and have so much accessible to us. But once people saw that those things, that there were shortages because manufacturers couldn't ship or shippers couldn't get things to a destination, that was sort of a broad awakening in the U.S. as well as globally. So that is what has struck people, at home with their families and in their pocketbook. The other side to that has been all of the teleworking, where school is now long distance learning, but people are working from home. And this, the concern from a working from home perspective is that we're relying on people's home networks to be secure when they connect to our corporate or government networks. So that's just the inherent vulnerabilities of that kind of environment exacerbates all elements of risk, I think.
It's one of the things that has shown up many times is this urgency during the pandemic for agencies to support more remote workers, to kind of get more VPN licenses and VDI and things of that nature. At the same time, there's a broader risk surface that comes with that.
Right.
Is that true with the supply chain too? Meaning, as agencies ramped up to support people, whether again remote working or digital services for citizens, did that also have a kind of effect on the supply chain, that urgency as well?
So from a, I'm going to answer that from my perspective, from a counterintelligence perspective. So that expands the attack surface. So someone at home where you have your own network, maybe you have kids or relatives who are all on your local network while you're doing work. And you bring in third-party applications onto your maybe you have a VPN for your office environment, and you bring in other types of applications to be in the mix on your operating system. Many times, government organizations or corporate entities that have policies of bring your own device to work, that those aren't, freewheeling policies that anything goes. Local CIOs will have, a BYOD policy that says, if you want to connect your device, you have to do the following things. So I think with the pandemic, some of those restrictions are a little fuzzy on the edges now. So I think that's kind of the dynamic we're currently in.
I've heard that many times from agencies, from CIOs who are trying to say, okay, now that our risk surface is more broad, then we also have to deal with these other pieces and parts like BYOD. From your perspective, is the threats and concerns around supply chain, how has that kind of evolved? And is there a bigger attention now to, for instance, foreign involvement in the supply chain? Is that something that you all, from the counterintelligence perspective, are paying a lot more attention to?
Well, so let me, just from a vocabulary perspective, lay out how I think of supply chain risk. I view this from a counterintelligence perspective, not so much about counterfeits in our supply chain, but rather an adversary using a company as a threat vector. So that might be a company might be complicit or not in being used as a threat vector. So that's and what kind of untoward level of influence an adversary government may have is certainly a concern. But I want to flip your question a little bit and speak on a more positive side about government involvement. We have been thinking about, as a government, as a nation, those things that we don't want on our networks. So that's sort of a negative perspective. What do we want to ban? What do we not want to deal with? But if you say no to something, to what are you saying yes? So this is a healthy conversation to have, and I would point to the international discussions that led to the Prague proposals, Prague principles, where several governments came together to talk about managing risk in a 5G environment, and the need to look at technical factors and non-technical factors when making decisions about how you're going to work with suppliers for your telecommunications infrastructure. So a lot of good work there. The EU in their digital toolbox that has been developed to look at high-risk vendors. We've had conversations like that. But now the conversation is shifting to what are positive attributes of business partners that we want to do business with? How do we collectively, globally, develop trusted markets? How do we think about manufacturing in one country, packaging a device in another country, but doing this with a greater degree of trust? So the conversation has shifted from just the negative to now the positive. How do we stimulate the innovation ecosystem to build things that we do want to procure in a more trustworthy manner?
It's almost like you're setting me up, Joyce. I know the next question, but we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to figure that they're going to try to answer that question because I have a feeling it's all about the data. So let's take a quick break. You're listening to Modernizing Government, Supply Chain Risk and Security, sponsored by KPMG on Federal News Network.